Mary Sue Hubbard was L. Ron Hubbard's wife, and she was also in charge of the Guardian's office protecting Hubbard and Scientology through the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s. She also was involved with the Snow White program, which was the largest infiltration of the United States government in terms of stealing documents and things like that from agencies, and went to prison to defend Hubbard and Scientology. She then was discarded by Scientology after Hubbard's death, and we're going to go into details about that. This is part one of our story about Mary Sue Hubbard. Janis Gillham Grady, my co-host, was around Mary Sue Hubbard from the age of 11 years old. She was friends with the Hubbard children. And also Mary Sue Hubbard was Janis's guardian on the flagship Apollo when Janis's parents weren't around. So she had a very close relationship with Mary Sue, as well as her time as a messenger with L. Ron Hubbard. She's going to tell some interesting stories that I think you're going to enjoy. Please stay tuned for part one of our story about Mary Sue Hubbard. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our channel, Scientology Peeling the Onion. My name is Mark Fisher, and I'm here with my co-host, Janis Gillham Grady. G'day, Janis. How you doing today?
G'day, everyone. G'day, Mark. Doing good. It's great. I'm back in Vegas. I'm at home. The dogs are happy. Yeah, everything's good.
That's great. That's great. Well, we're going to do a show about Mary Sue Hubbard, who was obviously married to L. Ron Hubbard, all the way up until the time that he passed away in 1986. But she had started in Scientology in the 1950s. She was the mother of, several of his children. And she was loyal, devoted to him for years and years and years. And then, of course, she also was the head of the Guardian's office, which later was replaced by the Office of Special Affairs. And she was responsible for making sure that Hubbard and Scientology were kept protected from government agencies and law enforcement and things like that. And she eventually went to prison over the Snow White program, which involved infiltrating the government back in the 1970s and basically stealing documents and stuff. And Janis has personal stories regarding her because Janis was at St. Hill as a 10, 11-year-old or whatever, a young child, and basically was friends with the Hubbard kids, and Mary Sue took care of her. And so we're going to tell stories about Mary Sue Hubbard, and we have photos that we'll share with you, and we hope you enjoy them.
Okay. Well, the first time I knew who Mary Sue was in 1962, when my parents went to St. Hill for the St. Hill Special Briefing Course. My mother met Mary Sue. Terry and I, we were left with our grandmother in Australia, but our brother went over to England with them because my grandmother had already raised 3 boys and didn't want another boy. So Terry and I went to our grandmother, and my brother and parents went to St. Hill. Now here's a picture of L. Ron Hubbard. You can see him there on the right side in the short sleeves with the blue vest. And right behind him is a gentleman in a suit and tie. That's my dad. And other pictures the church has released, the Church of Scientology has released of this, they've actually erased my dad from the picture. They've erased Herbie Parkhouse from the picture and a couple of other people. I think Red Sharp was in there and erased as well. Anyway, this picture in the front on the bicycle in the dressing gown, red hair, is Suzette Hubbard. Mm-hmm. And she is the 3rd child with Mary Sue Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard had, he had Nibs, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., he had Katie and Alexis, then Diana, with Mary Sue. Mary Sue's first child was Diana, and then Quentin, Suzette, and then Arthur. And that's Suzette there. And pushing her on the bike is my brother, Peter, at 9 years old in 1962.
Wow.
So that's the first time I knew who the Hubbards were. And my mother came back from England and set us up doing pen pal with the Hubbard children. And so we were pen pals until 1966, when we actually showed up at St. Hill, and my mom was already there. And this is my mom and my dad at the New Year's party for going into 1967. And that's Hubbard there. So now, while I was at St. Hill, I got there, I was 10 years old, and I left when I was 11. But every day after school, I'd usually catch the bus and go to St. Hill. And my mom worked in the monkey room in St. Hill Manor. And it was called the monkey room because Sir Winston Churchill's grandson had painted monkeys in that whole room. And Hubbard had plastic put over to preserve it. Anyway, that's where my mom worked, in Herbie Parkhouse and Phoebe Maurer. And I'd get to St. Hill and I'd go to the canteen, get Phoebe and Mom coffee and take it in. And then I'd go find the Hubbard kids, or I'd wait till they got home from school. And so my brother, my sister, and I would play with Diana, Quentin, and Suzette. Arthur was much younger than our group, so we kind of ignored him, or we took him along if we had to.
Let me show this photo here of Hubbard with the kids here.
Yeah. So in the middle is Hubbard, and to the left is Diana, the tallest one, and then Quentin next to her, and then on the other side is Suzette, and sitting on the desk is Arthur. And then here is Mary Sue with Hubbard, and that's just Quentin, Diana, and Suzette. And now Mary Sue.
One other picture I was going to show to you real quick. Here is this one here.
Yeah, that's in the winter garden of St. Hill Manor. And we used to, as kids, would go in there, the Hubbards and the Gillham kids, and we would play bones or jacks. Or we'd go in and we'd play cards. And there was these grates. And underneath there were hot pipes that heated the room. And we might lose a jack or a bone down the grates. And if Hubbard came in to get a tab from the Winter Garden refrigerator, because his office was right next door, he would help us lift up the grates and get the jacks out. And Mary Sue would come in and check on us and so forth. But she was heavily into working at that time.
Let me ask you, can I ask you a question? Can you remember being that young? What did you think of Hubbard and Mary Sue? Were they just parents of these kids that you're hanging out with? I mean, like, did you realize, who he was or anything like that? Or was it just, you were just so young? What was it like?
No, it's kind of, I knew everybody looked up to him. He was called Ron and she was called Mary Sue, or he called her Susie. And so even old timers sometimes called her Susie because that's what he referred to her as. Mm-hmm. And if anyone says her name was Mary, no, it was Mary Sue or Susie. But anyway, yeah, I kind of recognized who Hubbard was because, all the students would gather around as he'd take a walk, And Mary Sue, to me, she was just the parent. Terry and I would ride our bike to St. Hill, our bikes. And I remember one time we were doing bike races down the driveway in front of the manor. And Suzette didn't have a bike. And so she borrowed Terry's bike. And Vixie, Mary Sue's dog, was known for chasing cars. Vixie went chasing after Suzette's bike. Suzette, of course, slams on the front brake of the bike. So, of course, goes over the handlebars. So Arthur was there, and we're like, Arthur, quick, go get your mom. So Arthur ran in and got his mom. There's Vixie. When she used to bark at someone, it was said, oh, they're out ethics. Vixie knows. She was a nasty little corgi. And that picture shows her true character. Anyway, so Arthur ran in and got Mary Sue. Mary Sue came out, made sure, put a bandage on Suzette, made sure she was okay. And then she took Terry's bike and she went and she got a toolkit from the garage and came out and she fixed the spokes on the bike. Hubbard, I think, was down in South Africa at this time. Mm-hmm. So, so she made sure the bike was, good as new again after Suzette had wrecked it. And that was kind of my very first real experience with her, was seeing her do that. And then I don't think I saw her again until I showed up on the Royal Scotsman in January 1968. And but let's go back to Mary Sue's history of who she was.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. So she was 19 when she married Hubbard. And they'd been motorbiking around Spain. Mary Sue used to talk about that, in my later years. And she was pregnant when they married, and she had Diana in London. And then later on, they had Quentin in Phoenix. There's Hubbard with his oldest daughter, Katie Gillespie.
She's from another previous wife.
Right. She's from the first wife, Polly, and then Mary Sue. Katie and Mary Sue are pretty close in age. I think there was a 20-year difference between Mary Sue and Hubbard. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so they went to Phoenix, and Quentin was born in Phoenix. And I forgot where Suzette was born. I think it was Phoenix or DC. And then years later, Arthur was born. Anyway, Suzette was the one I was the closest to. She was in between my sisters and my age. So the three of us spent a lot of time together. And Quentin was older than my sisters. So it was kind of us four, with Quentin would steal money out of the wishing well by the chapel at St. Hill and then go to the canteen. I was like, I don't want to take the money from there. And Quentin's like, oh, it's okay. And so he would take his shoes and socks off, climb in and gather the money up from the well, and then we'd go over to the canteen. Anyway, so that was one of our thieveries at St. Hill. So here's Mary Sue talking to a bunch of students there for Hubbard. And this again was in the 50s. And if you listen to any of the old, what was called the wall of tapes, those were all the tapes on the St. Hill Special Briefing course of Hubbard's lectures. You'll notice in those tapes, unless they have now cut it out in their edits, he always introduces Mary Sue as Susie. And Mary Sue actually told me that is when she started smoking. She had to go to all these lectures as his wife, and it became a social thing of, something to do, and she started smoking. Yeah. And I don't think she ever quit.
So she looks like she was disseminating, like she was lecturing or doing public, speaking of some sort, right? Back in those days.
Yeah, she did help doing that. So she was very much there. And then here's her at St. Hill again. She worked a lot on the finances. She worked on legal stuff and actually became the first guardian. And when she went to the Royal Scotsman in 1967, Jane Kember replaced her as the guardian.
Explain to everybody what the guardian is.
The guardian was the guardian's office was there to kind of protect and oversee and make sure Scientology continued to exist and was in legal compliance with local laws. And if a Scientologist got in trouble with the legal system, the guardian's office would come forth to help get them out of trouble and help clean up the public relations or the bad press that might be happening from that individual.
And that was necessary because of like the ban in Australia, the problems in the United Kingdom, right? Things like that, right? Governments,
yes,
in trouble.
Yeah.
Right?
And Mary Sue actually, going through Fair Game, a book written by Steve Canine on the whole Australian Scientology connections. In there, he actually has copies of letters that Mary Sue had written to my mother that became part of the legal documents for the Anderson case, which banned Scientology in Victoria in 1965. So Mary Sue was very much involved in the legal stuff back then as well in 1965. So yeah, she was like the right-hand man for Hubbard, and if he was gone, she was pretty much in charge running things.
Right.
This is her on her clear night. I believe that was. And there's a whole write-up on her as clear number 208. And this was the days of doing the clearing course. This was not, later on, clear was changed to, if you went Dianetic clear, you got status as a clear, and you didn't have to do certain other processes, where in this time and age, you had to do all your grades 1 to 4. You then had to do power processing, which was 5 and 5A. And then you had to do the grade 6, which was R6EW, which you solo audited. And then you did the clearing course, which was also solo auditing. It wasn't another person there asking you questions and directing you. You had to do it yourself.
Now, Janis, do you remember what your clear number is?
No, it was around 1,000 and something.
I remember mine, 9766, 9,766.
Yeah. No, I did my clearing course in, it was, I think, March of 1977 is when I went clear. And then I did OT1 in Clearwater, and then OT2, and then started OT3 before I went over to La Quinta in California.
You know, one of the things that I really, really wanted to get when I went clear, I really, really wanted to get a clear bracelet. This was when you went clear, you were then allowed to have what was called a clear. It was a sterling silver bracelet with the Scientology symbol on
right.
it, double triangles, and it looked really cool when it tarnished because it had like a raised S and double triangles, and then it would tarnish behind it, so it would look black back there, and then the Scientology symbol would stand out, and then on the other side they would engrave your name and your clear number. And I remember I was so happy and proud when I got to get my clear bracelet. And of course, when I left Scientology or whatever they took it, I didn't get to keep it any longer.
Well, my clear bracelet story is I didn't like silver. I didn't like wearing silver.
Yeah.
So any jewelry I wore was always gold. So I had a gold clear bracelet made up, and I didn't like it. So later on, I got that and gathered all my scrap gold that I didn't want. And I had it melted down and made into a much better clear bracelet. And then Paul had purchased from Glenn Samuels, whose family was in the diamond business, 3 diamonds, and he had them inserted in my clear bracelet. And then when we were on our honeymoon and we flew from LA to Hawaii, I fell asleep on the plane. And when I got off the plane, I'm like, where's my clear bracelet? And they wouldn't let me back on the plane. And of course, never saw it again. My melted down gold and the 3 diamonds gone.
Wow.
Never got another clear bracelet after that.
Yeah, because I remember then they had an OT bracelet too, but that didn't really take off. It was more the clear bracelet. You know what I mean?
The OT bracelet, I think, took off more with the OT8 completions. Those guys got more into it, or the wealthier people. I know my dad had a gold OT bracelet, which, I sold to an investor.
One other thing I was going to ask you. Well, one other thing I was going to ask you about Mary Sue, because you showed me this before. Show everybody that booklet that you found that Mary Sue. Mary Sue is involved with a lot of things, right? Well, this is the book of e-meter drills, which are the drills that you do to learn to use the e-meter, and they were compiled. It says right there by Mary Sue Hubbard. Forward by L. Hubbard.
What I found out later in years working with Hubbard and Mary Sue, that a lot of the books that Hubbard wrote, those came from compilations done by Mary Sue and others from his lectures and turned into books. So Mary Sue worked heavily in the background, putting those books together from the lectures.
That would have been like the Phoenix Lectures, which was a book, but that was based off of the lectures, something like that, right? As an example.
Right. Yeah. As an example. Yes. So, yeah. And other different books and stuff, it was compiled from lectures and put into book form. So she was very, very involved in that. Yes.
This is a cute photo. That's Quentin, right? Her son dancing with Mary Sue.
Yes.
My question was going to be, she was very close to her kids, right? Her whole life?
Yes, she was very close to her kids and very protective of her kids. And, I remember at St. Hill, one of my friends from Australia, she was a couple years younger than me. Her mom was being sent on a project. And so Mary Sue said, her name was Julie. Mary Sue said, well, Julie can come and stay with us, because Julie used to come to St. Hill and was best friends with Arthur. They were like the same age and always played together. So Mary Sue set Julie up in Arthur's room. And at nighttime, she'd come down and read stories to them both, and Julie, I think, spent like probably 4 days at least, living in the manor with Arthur and Mary Sue taking care of her. So Julie must have been about 7 or 8 at that time.
Wow.
Anyway, and Mary Sue, very social. She liked, talking with the different ladies at St. Hill, and became good friends with those old time Scientology friends. Marie Maloney, my mom, Phoebe, all those kind of people Mary Sue used to hang out with and go and chat and so forth.
She was from Texas, right? That's where she was from originally, Texas?
Yeah, she was from Texas. And it's funny.
People have big personalities and they're very friendly.
Yeah. And even on the ship, she'd still, wear some Texas wear. If we weren't wearing uniform, she'd put on her cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. But yeah, she loved Texas. And, when we were in Madeira and her brother was coming to visit. So Hubbard had the household unit rent a house there in Madeira. So that they could have, they had the kids come off the ship, Diana, Suzette, Arthur, and Quentin. And Mary Sue's brother came and stayed with them and, in Madeira, so that she could spend some time with her brother. Talking about Mary Sue doing compiling and stuff like that, when the Sea Org first started, she did all the compilations then as well of the Sea Watch picture book. And that was a book with pictures in it and typed, words and stuff like that, to teach you how to tie a knot, how to read a compass, all the different stuff, what the job of a lookout does, all the signals, what the radio operator does. She's the one who compiled all that stuff for the very basic training of Sea Org members when they arrive and get their feet wet on a ship. So I arrive in January of 1968. And my mom had sailed the day before with Hubbard on Mission into Time on the Avon River. But Mary Sue was on the Royal Scotsman with her kids, with Quentin, Suzette, and Arthur. Diana was on the Avon with her dad. Diana was probably 15 at the time, because my brother was 14. And as soon as my brother turned 15 in March, he asked Hubbard if he could transfer over to the Avon to be with my mom. And, so my brother got off the Scotsman and got over on the Avon, because now he was 15 and couldn't say no because Diana was there and she was 15. When I arrived on the ship in January 1968 with my brother and sister, Mom wasn't there. So we come aboard. What do? Well, you need to work for your keep. So we were assigned to the galley, Terry and I washing dishes and my brother washing pots. But Mary Sue came to us and said, I promised your mom I'd take care of you while she was gone. So Mom knew we were coming, but she, of course, that was her duty to sail off with Hubbard. So Mary Sue was our legal guardian. And there was other people that knew us that were like, don't worry, we'll oversee you. Phoebe was very much like that, and Liz Sabine was like that. Anyway, so we got to work doing dishes and so forth. And then my dad finally shows up, and Mary Sue, of course, was on board doing her stuff as with the Guardian's office from a distance, but not much involved with the ship. My dad shows up, and he sees all these outnesses that are happening. The ship's going up and down and pulling the lines, with the tide, and no one was slackening them off or tightening them up. And he wrote a letter to Hubbard, and he sent it over. He gave it to Dusty Rhodes, who was the communicator, and said, can you give this to Yvonne? Because he put it in an envelope to Yvonne, knowing Yvonne was Commodore Stewart. Uh-huh. So So Mom gets it, and she gives it to Hubbard. And this was right at the same time that the Avon had come back from mission into time. We were out at, not at sea anchor, but we were out at kind of anchored in the harbor with lines going to the seawall. And a storm comes up, and we are dragging our anchor, and we're going in, and we hit the rocks. And Hubbard is just going nuts on the Avon River. My mom brings out the bullhorn, and he's yelling and screaming, and there's nothing he could do. The ship was there, you know, but he couldn't do anything. So they get a dinghy over the side, and he gets over, comes in the cattle doors, goes up the bridge, gets the ship under the control. And then we're assigned a condition of liability, the whole crew. And meanwhile, he then works out getting the advanced organization on the ship, getting that off and onto shore, and only the ship people left behind. So there was maybe 60 of us. Now, he was going to send Mary Sue back to St. Hill. He was so mad that there she was, and she'd been his right-hand man, and she did nothing about it. So I got reports from someone else who was on the Avon that Hubbard was screaming like crazy at Mary Sue and threatening to send her and the children back to St. Hill. And she pleaded to stay. She wanted to help. She'll make it go right. And she said, make me the captain and I will train that crew. So he made her the captain of the Royal Scotsman. And her experience was maybe sailing on the Enchanter with him and doing the Sea-Watch picture books. So she had that theory there, but no real practical. Anyway, so she became the captain, and the liability cruise happened. And here's Mary Sue with Phoebe Maurer. And Mary Sue sails off with us as the captain, but she took with her John O'Keefe, who was a trained sailor. He used to be the captain of the Avon until he took the ship into a storm, and then Hubbard removed him. And everyone else was coming into port where John O'Keefe took the Avon out, and he got in trouble for that. But anyway, so Mary Sue became the captain, and we did the liability cruise with lots of drills and so forth. And there's a whole tape of that we did, Mark, where I'm talking to Neville Chamberlain. Yes, we're talking to Neville Chamberlain. We're telling stories of the liability cruise. And that was the time period that Mary Sue was the captain. And there she is. She had Captain Bill as well to support her. And she was wonderful to work for. She didn't go around yelling and screaming. She was very kind of peaceful and, here, let's just do this. And she was into solutions. Anyway, and I do have stories, though, that while everyone was in liability, she was up in what later became the Commodore's office, research room. But she and John O'Keefe and Baron Berez and Candy Swanson were up there, and Neville Chamberlain were up there with music going and drinking beer and having a good time. Anyway, so she gets us out of the condition of liability, and then we sailed to Marseille, and there's a picture here of when the Commodore comes aboard, and he's with Mary Sue, and I think, right there. So that's Pat Lipschitz on the left, and there's Hubbard, and there's Mary Sue, and Leon Steinberg, and Irene Derman. People knew her as Irene Dunleavy or Irene Howie. So we're in Marseille, and he comes back aboard. She'd been the captain up to that point. And Steiny actually had been the captain before her, and he got removed over the hitting the rocks and so forth. Right. Anyway, so at that point, she then became more and more involved in the Guardian's office again, and her office was on the promenade deck where the Commodore's office was, and all of the Commodore's aides. And she needed a communicator, so Nikki Freeman, who used to be married to Frankie Freeman, became Mary Sue's communicator and had an office right next to her. There's Nikki in white go-go boots.
In the middle. Right.
And and Frank, you can see Frankie through that arm, that bent arm, and Mary Sue.
how old were you then during the liability cruise?
I was 11.
11. Okay. So, and then she was being basically your guardian on the ship because your mother wasn't there, right? So,
Right.
During that time that she was basically being your guardian because your mother or your father weren't there, what was she like to deal with? Or did she take any interest in what you were doing or watch over you in any way? Do you have any stories about that?
Well, she did, because Suzette was my best friend. So Suzette and I were always together. Suzette wanted to go see her mom. I'd be with her. I was that tag along friend. And we were in one of the ports, and Candy was our tutor. And
Candy Swanson?
Yeah. And Candy was like, I got to get these kids off the ship. So Candy got permission from Mary Sue to take us kids ashore. And we all went to the beach. And because we were in liability, no one was allowed to shower. So we come back from the beach and we're salty and sandy and cold. So Suzette and I got to Mary Sue. Oh, we're cold. Can we take a hot shower? So of course she said yes. So we got to get a hot shower. Nobody else did.
Wow.
And then, so that was during the liability cruise. And then even another time later on, Suzette in her cabin, she had gotten a little hot plate, and she had a frying pan. And instead of going in the kitchen to do this, what we used to do is we'd get potatoes from the galley, and butter, and we would go to her cabin and we would fry up potatoes. We make our own French fries with butter. And one time we were doing this, and the pan of hot butter, I hit it or she hit it, fell, and it burnt my leg with this hot butter. And Suzette ran up to her mom and was like, Janis is burnt. So Mary Sue came down and had Nikki go to the galley and get some iced tea and some butter to put on it, and got me all patched up and everything. So that's another one of the stories. And I remember I was a messenger at that time with Hubbard, and because my knee was all wrapped up, I couldn't wear pants, so I showed up on watch in a skirt and flip-flops. And that's when Hubbard was like, why are you wearing flip-flops? I'm like, well, because sneakers don't go with the dress. People do that all the time now, but I would sneakers with a dress? No, even sandals with a dress. Anyway, so that's when I got a lecture about flip-flops and how if someone stepped on the back, it can cut your toes, and so I never showed up on watch again with flip-flops until years later in Hemet. And that's another story. He got me another pair of shoes to replace them. Anyway, so so Mary Sue was very caring and kind of oversaw. And even over the years as I was on watch, she'd see me sitting at the end of the hall while Hubbard was down in his cabin. And she would come and she'd sit down next to me and talk to me and tell me, oh, I just got a letter from your dad. He's asking if I'm making sure you're brushing your teeth and that you're doing okay. And, and she'd talk about my mother, and she'd hope that Terry and I don't put on weight and get chubby like our mother did when she went to America.
Now, let me ask you this. What about school? Like, I know we've done this show with Candy Swanson, who was basically you guys' tutor, right? But like, was Mary Sue insistent on like Suzette and Arthur and Quentin and all them going to school and learning, or did they learn with you at the same time, or what? How'd that work?
Well, when I first came on the ship, Sylvia Hare, Fred Hare's mother, was a teacher. She was the tutor for the Hubbard children and a few others. And when I was looking to go to school and I went to Sylvia, she was like, no, I'm not. I'm the Hubbard children's teacher. So we didn't have school when I first got there. But Mary Sue never followed up on our schooling that I'm aware of. Hubbard's the one who followed up on it and would have message runs to the tutor, or, have them do up a list of all the flashcards of different words. It was like 2,500 words she had to do flashcards for, and then get us to learn all those different words. But yeah, I don't remember Mary Sue getting involved in our tutoring. Yes.
I just thought of another question. Hubbard, obviously, he was a science fiction writer and very prolific as an author. As when you were kids or teenagers, or when you were a messenger, did he ever recommend books for you guys to read other than Scientology stuff? You know what I mean? Like, was he ever like, oh, you should read these books, they're really good, or you'll learn something from them, or anything like that?
No, not that I remember. You know, we used to read Zane Grey and different books like that, or
Adventure stories,
romance and adventure and cowboy is what we would read.
Yeah.
And that's when he was like, okay, no more novels. You have to learn the Scientology dictionary verbatim. You know, so then we'd have to do that. And that's when I ended up in the crow's nest, because I came in last place. Anyway, so yeah, but you know, Hubbard, if you did a message run with him and he said a word you didn't understand, you'd get in trouble if you didn't ask what that word meant. And sometimes we'd go, okay, we got the message, and we'd go off not knowing what the word meant, come back and have screwed up the message. And there were times where I said, well, I don't understand what this word is. And then he'd get into clearing the word with me. Sometimes he'd just tell me, and sometimes he'd have me get a dictionary. And then I used to have a lot of trouble with words, spelling and pronunciations. And I remember he spent like maybe an hour and a half during my messenger time on watch, clearing a word and going down the chain of words in that definition that I didn't understand. And I was going through, I was crying. It's like going through all sorts of things. I'm trying to clear this word. And he stuck with me to get me till I finally, okay, now I get it. And then I was able to go off on the message run.
One of the questions, since you then started becoming a messenger for Hubbard, right? At whatever, were you 12, 13 years old? Whenever
I just turned 12.
And your sister too, right? Your sister also started
She came later. She was 13 or 14. Yeah, 13.
Got it. But I was just saying, so you started being a messenger, and then the messengers were created. Hubbard, you guys started getting more and more, teenagers in as Hubbard's messengers on the Apollo, right? Now, Mary Sue's relationship to the messengers, though, that wasn't. She didn't have a good relationship with that, or tell us the story about that, because I know that's part of the history of the messengers.
She was okay with Terry, myself, Annie, and Claire. We were the 4 main original messengers. There were other messengers before Claire and Annie and Terry, but, they kind of turned over, or they came and they left, with their parents. And so I was one of the original. Quentin and I were the very first 2 messengers to stand watches. Mm-hmm. And then other young kids on the ship, they were all kind of rotated through. And if you lasted, you lasted. If you didn't last, and most of them didn't last because they ended up leaving with their parents, or some, would get in trouble.
Right.
But anyway, so the final 4 were Claire, Terry, Annie, and myself. And we were the longest together up until 1970, 71, when 3 more people were added, and we had 7 messengers. And Mary Sue didn't seem to mind the next 3 added. That was Clarice and Molly and Doreen Doe, my sister-in-law. But then after that, as there became more and more messengers, Mary Sue didn't like all of them, and she had trouble with them. And I remember a message run. I was the senior messenger of the watch, and Jill Goodman was my second messenger. And she had a message run with Diana. And Diana's office, Mary Sue's was on the starboard side, and Diana's was pretty much directly across on the port side. And Mary Sue heard the messages going back and forth with Diana. And Hubbard was pretty upset with her, to the point that he told Jill, you go spit at her. So if it was me, I wouldn't have spat. But Jill, not having the experience, went and spat at Mary Sue. Spat at Diana. That upset Diana, who screamed. Mary Sue then comes out, and Mary Sue starts screaming at Jill. And Mary Sue ends
Rightfully
up.
so. Rightfully so.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And Mary Sue ends up throwing her shoes at Jill, as Jill's going back into Hubbard's office. And then Hubbard's now protecting Jill from Mary Sue because he's the one that told Jill what to do, and Jill did it. So that created a big fight between Hubbard and Mary Sue. But,
how would they resolve things like that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, as a messenger, you had to be careful and not create a conflict between them. And then they'd have to sit down and they would talk it out, And there's times Mary Sue would just storm out of his office during an argument, and then he'd just let her settle down and then go over. Susie, come here, let's talk this over, and then Susie would go back in. Yeah.
So how is that normally how they would sort of, if they got, like, they obviously got in arguments, right? Hubbard and Mary Sue. So they would go behind closed doors and try and sort it all out?
Yeah, go to his office, or sometimes, their cabins were right next to each other, and you could go from her cabin through a bathroom to his cabin. And so she might, at nighttime, she would go through over to his cabin, or he'd go over to her cabin, and they'd talk it out. Now here, this is where they had breakfast every morning. This is the aft portside corner of the research room, and there's a steward in the blue velvet pants. But there's Mary Sue on the left and Hubbard. And every morning when Hubbard woke up, we'd let Mary Sue know. And then when he'd come upstairs, he'd go and he'd sit down and start handling his in basket while breakfast is being cooked. And then when the steward came up with breakfast, we'd let Mary Sue know, and she would come in and join him. And she'd come in and she'd kiss him on the forehead and go, "Good morning, baby," and, sit down and chat with him the whole time he's eating. And she'd eat with him if she hadn't already had breakfast. Most of the time, she'd just wait until it was time to eat with him, unless it was real late. But, so they had a good, sweet relationship. And over the years, you could see if he was getting mad about something, and you could hear him yelling, because she was right outside his office pretty much. She would get up and come in and try and, help the messengers calm him down. And, she'd say that she'd handle it, or the messenger would say she'd handle it, and Mary Sue would just stay until he started just talking normal, and wasn't yelling and screaming about it anymore. She was very good, and she worked with us on that. But,
could she calm him down? Was she good at calming him down?
Very good at calming him down. And it was always useful to have her around because of that.
Now, were messengers like you, since you were close to both Hubbard and Mary Sue, if you guys were having a problem with LRH, could you go to Mary Sue and say, "Hey, I don't understand," or "Something's going on"? Do you know what I mean? Or was that like totally remote? You can't do that.
We didn't, and we didn't even think of that, but she would hear it, and she would know when it was time to come in.
Uh-huh.
And it's just like when he blew up at Otto Roosevelt, Otto saying that Hubbard had rock slams, and Hubbard was yelling and screaming about it. Mary Sue went in there, and she was there when I had the message runs going back and forth with Otto. And then Otto was like, "It's probably better if I go up there and see him myself." Well, that wasn't a very good idea, but Otto went in there anyway, and Hubbard went to take a swing at him, and Mary Sue was going on at Otto about how I was his order for all these years, and I never once saw a rock slam, and but she was there to help trying to calm Hubbard down over that and defend him.
Yeah, here's a picture. This is what she looked like back in those days on the Apollo.
Yeah. And, it's funny. You'll see that she's got the same hairstyle all these years. And that's because Hubbard liked it. She'd thought of changing it, and he didn't want her to. And there was a period she was dyeing her hair red, and that's why some people say she had red hair. But if you see in that bottom right-hand picture, that's not red hair. It was a mousy blonde type of thing. Or people might say it's a dirty brown or a dirty blonde. But she curled her hair. All those are ringlets that she curled on her forehead. And she
wasn't naturally curly then, huh?
No.
Oh.
But she was funny. She'd sit there at the breakfast table or dinner table or while he's talking, and she would twirl her hair in her fingers like this, or her hair when she hadn't cut her bangs enough, often enough, the heaviness of them would fall down, and she had a habit of pushing her bangs up like this.
Did she have any kind of messengers or people, young people working for her as well, like Hubbard did, or no?
Well, there was a point where the aides had a messenger and she could use them. And when Hubbard was gone in New York, we did messages for her, because she was now, all the mail packs would come into her from him, and then she'd have all these orders to now get out. And she didn't type. Nikki did the typing, or everything was written in her small handwriting. And then she would have us messengers go and run messages for her. So she used us during from December 72 until Hubbard came back in September 73. We did a lot of message runs for her during that time period.
Now she was only answerable to Hubbard, right? In other words, she didn't have somebody like Diana could have a senior. There'd be somebody who'd be senior to Diana over there.
Right. There was the staff captain who was over all the aides, but Mary Sue's direct senior was Hubbard. And you think of Snow White. He was in New York when that Snow White plan came about. And when he talked to me about it, what he said was different to what happened later on. He was
Let me briefly explain.
Okay.
Snow White, for our viewers who don't know, Snow White was a program that was developed, that the Guardian's office did. I don't know what Hubbard was involved. He obviously, Mary Sue wouldn't do something like this without Hubbard's knowledge. That's just the way it is. You know what I mean? But basically, that's when Hubbard, there had false reports about L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology and all the files and the government files. And there had been a raid in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s, and they took all the e-meters and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, all this sort of stuff. So the idea was to clear the files over the false reports. So they had Guardian's office members actually get hired by these different government agencies, the IRS and different government agencies, Justice Department, and they would go in there and they would Xerox the files on Scientology and basically steal them. And they got caught. And that was the whole reason for the raid in the 1970s, was because the main guy who was doing it got caught, and then he was taken away by the FBI and the Justice Department. And next thing you know, here comes the Justice Department raiding, right?
Yes. Okay.
I did a very shorthand version of what happened, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. When Hubbard came back from New York and was on the ship and the Snow White program was underway, and Fred Hare was assigned as Mary Sue's assistant for Snow White. So it was Fred's job to implement, there's Fred with the pipe in his mouth, with Hank Lahus, who was one of the original SEAL members. He was the treasurer at St. Hill when I was a kid there. He was wanted in the French fraud case, and the Guardian's office had him catch a train at midnight to get out of France and go back to Holland, where he set up a Scientology mission until the day he died. But yeah, there's Fred with his pipe. Anyway, so Fred was assigned as the assistant controller for Snow White, because Mary Sue was the controller. And when Hubbard was on the ship and came back from New York, he talked about the Snow White program, but his view was very different to what happened. He had told me that, there was a lot of these false reports in the files, and we'd already gone through a whole thing of getting kicked out of ports and the U.S. embassies following us and reporting on us and so forth. And I cover all those stories in my books. But Hubbard had said there's a lot of false reports from Interpol and different places in government files and from the raids from the FDA and that type of thing. And so the project was written to find the false reports and get the false documents replaced with the correct documents. And that's how Hubbard explained it. And so that's, whenever I heard Snow White, that's always what I thought was being done. Only to find out later on what you explained. And the Guardian's office in the U.S. had like 2,500 people infiltrated into different U.S. government offices. Now, when I talked to Charles Parcell, who was the deputy guardian for legal in England, and I asked him about Snow White and this stuff that was going on in the U.S. with the government, and Charles was like, I knew nothing about it until it got exposed in the raid. He said the orders weren't coming from worldwide. This was something that the U.S. office under Henning Helt was doing. But then I find out later that Henning when we were in Los Angeles and in La Quinta, Mary Sue used to write directly to Henning, and she had a communicator in the next office to Henning. So she was very much involved with the Guardian's office, U.S. Guardian's office that was located in the Manor Hotel, where Celebrity Center is now. They had the whole 6th floor and the 7th floor. Anyway, Henning, Mary Sue, as I said, didn't type. She had written instructions out to Henning in her handwriting, and Henning had a red box that all the undone Mary Sue orders were in. And he was supposed to take that box with him wherever he went, so no one could get a hold of it. Well, he got in the habit of leaving it on his desk. So when the FBI raided the Manor and the Guardian's office, they got a hold of the red box. And it was those documents in there in Mary Sue's handwriting that connected her to the crimes that the Guardian's office had been committing and ended up resulting in her going to jail. If that red box hadn't been there, I don't think they would have been able to have convicted her.
Right. And of course, this is way before the internet and emails and all that sort of stuff where they can electronically find it. A handwritten anything is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that, somebody was involved. It proves it's their handwriting and stuff. And then there was another factor involved too, because Jane Kember she was the guardian, right? And Mary Sue was the comptroller Jane Kember worked under Mary Sue, but she was located in Worldwide in St. Hill in England, right? So Mary Sue,
but they extradited her.
Yeah, but Mary Sue was on the Apollo, and then later Florida or wherever Hubbard was, and Jane was always in England, and then you had the U.S. Guardian's office. So it's all these different things, and there was no instant communication, so it was all dispatches and telexes and coding. I remember they had to code everything, you know what I mean, and decode it in order to be able to communicate and stuff, right?
Right, but the interesting thing in all this, Jane went to jail, Mary Sue went to jail. The one person who didn't get caught was Fred. And Fred was the one who was running the Snow White programs. From the ship and from Clearwater and from La Quinta, it was Fred.
They obviously had no evidence against him or something, right?
Probably. But I know after all this happened and DM took over and, anyone involved with the Guardian's office, couldn't get on any OT levels. And I talked to Fred shortly before he passed away. And he was telling me he was still trying to do amends, and he'd opened a mission in Miami and Clearwater. And he was still trying to do things to get his status back as a Scientologist. And to the day he died, that never happened. He couldn't get back in good standing where they would then let him onto the OT levels. So that was a big loss for him. But yeah.
Well, I was going to say, so basically, I mean, when the whole raid happened and they took everything, the Justice Department and all that, it was like all of a sudden, I mean, this caused Hubbard a lot of trouble because he then had to, he was afraid he was going to get connected to it. So then he would be like, I got to leave. And then he would go, right? He'd leave wherever he was at the time at W and go to Sparks and then, this and that, right?
Right. Yeah, we were at W at the time. This was 1977, in July, I believe it was. Yeah, in La Quinta. And the word came in that the FBI was raiding the manor and the blue building, because the intel office of the Guardian's office was over there in the blue building, just off the horseshoe entrance.
And it wasn't blue at that time. It was just the Cedars-Sinai Hospital that they just bought about a year before.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But anyway, so as soon as Hubbard got word about that, it was like, pack my bags. So his cars were out front of Rifle, where he lived, and outside was the messenger station wagon that we called Beauty. It was like a golden station wagon. So Hubbard's bags got packed, and it was decided that Dee Dee, Claire, and Pat would go. And Pat was picked. Pat wasn't a messenger at the time, but he was picked. He was one of Hubbard's PRs. He had been married to a messenger, and he had been doing special projects with one of the messengers when we were setting up the Fort Harrison in Clearwater. So Pat had been around Hubbard, and and Pat was a very outgoing, and he was older than everybody else and had experience with the real world.
Yeah, and we told that story. We have a video on that when Hubbard went to Sparks, and there's a lot of comedy of errors of things that happened during that story. Anyway.
They had makeup, they had wigs on, they had sunglasses on. Claire left her bag on top of the car, and it got
they burned an umbrella cooking food and stuff. There's a lot of things.
That's a video that another one in our earlier days that we did. That if you're interested, comedy of errors. Anyway, so Hubbard took off to Sparks, and Mary Sue remained in La Quinta at the WHQ Winter Headquarters base. And she now became in charge and was running the base. And it was great working for her, because she didn't put pressure on everyone, the pressure that we always had from Hubbard. And she gave us, we had liberty, we had time off, we had longer meal times, instead of half-hour meals, we got an hour meal. She lightened up the schedule, which is how the Guardian's office was run. The Guardian's office was mostly non-Sea Org members, so they were on, Monday to Friday. They had weekends off. They had evenings off. They just worked regular business hours. And that's how she read things. And people who worked for her deputies, they all had easy schedules compared to the rest of us who worked for Hubbard. So it was really nice having Mary Sue run things. You knew you were safe, and you weren't going to get yelled at or anything like that. Though, there was a time, I just remembered this back on the ship. There was a time where she yelled at me. And that was what happened is Mary Sue and Hubbard were up at the breakfast table having breakfast. Vixie was down on the deck below, just barking and barking and barking, going crazy. And I had run by on a message run coming back. And Arthur, he used to love to tease Vixie, and Vixie would grab his jean bottoms and just pull and pull and pull like this. And Arthur used to drag her across the foyer. There was linoleum, and she'd be barking and having a fit. And it was a game that they always played. Anyway, so I go upstairs and I report back on my message, and Hubbard's like, "What's Vixie going on about?" And I said, "Oh, Arthur's teasing her." And okay, LRH was like, "Oh, okay, no big deal." Well, then Vixie goes for a walk on the dock with Mary Sue's steward, Corey Ellis. And then when Corey comes back, Mary Sue was talking to Corey and came up to me while I was on watch with Hubbard, put a finger in my face, wagging it. "You are the biggest liar on God's green earth." I'm like, what the hell? And she had gone to Corey and asked if Arthur had been teasing Vixie, and Corey said no. So I got accused of false reporting on Arthur for teasing Vixie. Everyone knew Arthur teased Vixie. Anyway, so I ended up in a condition of doubt. And Hubbard knew about it, and he did not come and protect me from Mary Sue on this. And, she was defending Arthur, her son. And even later on, Paul Preston, who had gone to New York with Hubbard. I'm not sure if it was before or after he went to New York, but he was the master at arms, and he had Arthur pulled in for. Arthur used to do stuff where you say something and he would repeat what you say, and he would keep doing this, and it got very irritating. Saying, how do you do? And the person says back, how do you do? And you go, no, how do you do? He goes, no, how do you do? And it gets very irritating. So Paul got real mad at him and blew a whistle. Well, Arthur tells Mary Sue. Mary Sue came down to Paul, found him in the tween decks, and blew a whistle right in his ear. This is how it feels, So that's her defending her son.
Yeah, that's
So.
right. Those are great stories. Anyway, we have a lot more to tell about Mary Sue because we've only gotten basically to, the 3/4 part of the story. There's a lot more stories to tell. So we're going to do a second episode where we'll carry on about this and carry on with what happened to her with the rest of her life, because she basically ended up going to prison. And we're going to go into details about that as well. But we hope you're enjoying this episode so far, Janis, and we appreciate your reflections and stories.
You're welcome. I'm enjoying this. It's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of Janis's stories, you need to order Janis's book. She goes into tremendous detail about her time in Scientology and the Sea Organization as a child on the flagship Apollo, and there she is right now. This is Commodore's Messenger, book 1, and that's Janis when she was like 12, 13 years old with Hubbard as a messenger walking on the Apollo. And then the second book, this is the second book here, part 2, book 2, and that's Janis. You're in somewhere in the Canary Islands or somewhere, right? Photo shoot.
Setúbal in Portugal. We were at a winery taking photos.
Yeah, exactly. Janis has spent pretty much more time than just about anybody. The messenger spent 6 hours a day, 7 days a week with Hubbard during her teenage years. And so she was just about as close to Hubbard as the rest of his family members were, if not more, because she spent more time with them. So if you're interested in getting either this is book 2, or if you're interested in getting book 1, either one, you can go down into our video description. There's a link to our merchandise store where you can order the book, and Janis will actually autograph it to you, and we'll send it out to you somewhere in the United States, anywhere in the United States. And when you order it, you just say if you want a personal message, Janis will write it in there, and it's available, right, Janis? And we'll ship it out.
Yes, it is, and also it is on Audible. Through Amazon, you can get it on Audible. Book 2 is not yet on Audible, but book 1 is. And there's lots of photos in these books as well. And they go from before I was born, when my parents got into Scientology, and it goes up to the point of the last days of the Royal Scotsman, the Apollo, and getting that sold, and then what happened to her. Because book 3, which I need to work on, I'm sorry I haven't, but that starts with us coming to America.
But you are working on the audio portion of book 2, right?
I was until I had grandchildren. Now I'm back home. Now I'm catching up, and I can get back onto that.
Okay, great. Well, you guys have that to look forward to. But you can get the books with the pictures and everything. Just go down to the video description. There's a link down there to the books. You can order the books there. And I think you really enjoy them. I know they're really great. And anyway, we're glad you all are here. The other thing I want to say, if you're enjoying these stories, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button. Hit that notification button. And you'll be notified whenever we have a new video that comes out. And we appreciate people, subscribing, because it helps YouTube get our videos out to other people that are interested in them. The other thing I want to mention is if you have any questions or comments, we read them all and we answer them as best we can. So please go down below and write any questions or comments. If you have questions about Mary Sue or comments, or did you ever have, run-ins with Mary Sue or work with Mary Sue, we're interested in your feedback and your stories. So just go down below to do that. And then finally, if you'd like to support our channel, we have minor expenses, but there are expenses to doing these shows. So you can help us by buying us a coffee. It's just a way to support the channel. And there's a link in the video description below where you can click on it, and then we appreciate any support that we get from our loyal viewers. Janis, that's the show for today. I think we've got an exciting one when we do part 2, which will be coming up shortly as well.
Yeah.
So we hope everybody
Yes.
enjoys it. If you got anything
All right,
else
well,
you'd like
thank
to
you,
say?
Mark. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely do. Until next time, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.